Joining us on the show now is Charles Tarbey, Chairman and owner of Century 21 Australasia, including PNG now as well, isn't that right?
Yeah, I've been there a while, but you just never mentioned it. But thanks anyway. Thanks.
How's things with you?
Yeah, pretty good. It's busy around the traps still right across the country. Some areas are still having a struggle, but most of the areas that we've been looking at and talking about for the last year and more so the last quarter are still bubbling along very, very nicely.
Well, let's jump into the clearance rates and tell us what's happening there.
They're slightly down over last week, 75.9%, so we've been in the mid to high 70s now for quite some time, Chris. Really interesting because most importantly, if you look at now compared to last year, it's been between 15 and 20 percentage points better in most capital cities for the last few months now than it has been this time last year. So even if we were in a pretty busy cycle last year, gee, it's gotten a lot busier again. Sydney was the best, and that came in at 83.4%. Now, you know Sydney's been in the 80s for quite some time, but Melbourne hit 77.7%, and Canberra came in at 68.9%. But the one that still interests me at the moment is Brisbane. That's been in the just under 50% clearance rate for a few weeks in a row. Now, you know, Brisbane would always sit 30, 35, maybe 40%. So there's a bit of energy starting to move in that area as well.
Now, there's a lot of talk up there about all the kind of brand new apartments, and obviously a lot of those don't hit the clearance rates, do they? Because they're all off the plan and private
Generally,
treaty.
yes, yeah, generally are, and they talk about that with Melbourne also, the glut of apartments coming into the marketplace, and the median price of property dropped last month, but when you dissect it, it wasn't to do with houses. Houses still moved. It was actually apartments that came backwards, came off the heat a little bit. So it's interesting that you can probably still get into that marketplace, even though, look, again, it's a long-term investment. If you're going to get in, you've got to think about it being a long-term situation.
Exactly. Now, any hope for homes advertised for sale?
Not in the area you're interested in at all. Generally, it's out of the question.
Screwed.
Most of the country, even though we'd like to see more, is actually down, Chris. We've had this roller coaster ride down 3.27% over this time last week. And it's the same in New Zealand, although the amount of stock that came on there in this last week was 14.9% higher. The amount of stock they have on the market compared to this time last year is much lower. So they made a lot more sales. So the stock base that we have in Australia and New Zealand is dropping, and and it should be increasing in winter. It's not increasing in winter. So something is still going to keep the market moving nice and hot.
Someone needs to come up with something to explain to people to sell the properties.
And interest rates dropped in New Zealand last week too, so that's going to move that along even more so.
OK, and what's happening with the rent price movement?
They're OK, they're nice and steady. You know, I was always wondering whether they'd be impacted a lot by more investors coming into the marketplace, but realistically New South Wales had a modest growth of 0.14%, and Melbourne had a modest growth of 0.21%, but Perth had a negative flow of minus 0.2%. So overall, from those three capital cities particularly, it's a plus 25.25, but for the year to date it's only down 1.68%. So we're almost 6 months into the year, and that's all the rents have dropped in spite of all of this investor activity that you're hearing about out there.
So it's just trying to put it into perspective.
Yeah.
And how about things with the vacancy rates?
Well, Sydney's fantastic, and that's been very low for quite some time at 1.82%. Now, Victoria creeped into the fours this week at 4.05. Now, my officers down there tell me, and I had meetings with them yesterday, St Kilda, Brighton, the vacancy rates are much higher in those areas than the average. So there's some areas that are suffering more than others. And Perth continues its move between 5 and 6, coming in at 5.89% this week. And over those three capital cities, there was an average of 3.92% vacancy. So still good from that point of view, but certain pockets are starting to struggle.
Now, very quickly, John talked about opportunities. A lot of people are getting worried about the bubble and all the bad news and the rest of it. Do you think there's still opportunities if you look hard enough?
Oh, definitely. If people are short-term thinkers in this industry, they're always going to be in a bubble all the time. That's part of the problem. Now, there's some great opportunities, and when you talk about the apartment transactions and them starting to stable, I think that's an area that I'd certainly be looking at, Chris.
Charles Tarbey, Century 21, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.
And thank you for joining us at home. We'll be back next week. Until then, I'm Chris Gray. Good night.